Okay, this next part we're going to finally get into the reflexes. So for emphasis, these reflexes, I'm going to teach you spinal reflexes, but there are certainly reflexes that occur that involve regions of the brainstem, even other regions of the brain. And so they're not confined just to the spinal cord, but we are going to look at the spinal cord reflexes because they're a little bit easier to understand. The reflex pathway is the same, at least generally in terms of patterns of information and how that is sent. It's the same regarding whether it's in the brainstem versus whether we're dealing with spinal cord. And ultimately, as you know, it's going to start with the depolarization of a receptor. So this would involve that generator potential that we talked about. And if that generator potential is supra-threshold, we're going to be getting the generation of action potentials. And depending on how strong that generator potential is, we might have a high frequency or a low frequency. Regardless, that information is going to come through on the afferent pathway, and we'll get the generation of these action potentials shown here, either high frequency or low frequency. Now that's going to be processed and sent onward on that afferent pathway. If we're actually going to make it to the brain, then depending on the location, we're going to be going through again that first order neuron, second order neuron, third order neuron before we get to the somatosensory cortex where we need to be. But in the spinal cord, with the spinal reflexes, we're really going to be dealing with just that first order neuron and the synapses that it makes in the spinal cord. Now, so that would involve then the propagation over labeled line, but really the labeled line, I guess that would apply to the central nervous system as well. To the spinal cord as well, but labeled line is really about how the brain perceives information. Now, once we get this information and it's processed and interpreted, then that's going to generate a response. We have two options in terms of motor pathways. Option one is to send information, and this will all depend on what needs to be done to maintain homeostasis or to protect us from injury. That's the basics there. And so for non-voluntary responses, this is going to be our smooth muscles, our glands, our heart. These are all non-voluntary muscle groups that are going to respond. Or the glands aren't muscle, but non-voluntary tissues. We can't control their response. We can't decide whether our heart's going to beat faster or slower. There's some people that can figure out how to do it with biofeedback and meditation, and I'm not one of those. It takes years of practice, but regardless, we generally speaking can't regulate it, and so our process that's going to be involved would be to stimulate the motor system, and for the non-voluntary processes, the involuntary ones, that's going to be the autonomic nervous system. So that autonomic nervous system will involve the sympathetic nervous system, the parasympathetic nervous system, and we are going to talk about this in significant detail for our next set of lectures. The voluntary responses are going to be skeletal muscle. That's essentially it. And so if we're going to generate a voluntary response, that typically is going to involve activation of those skeletal muscle, and which will cause us to move reflectively. And generally, we don't have a choice there, even though it's technically voluntary because it's skeletal muscle. The reality is, if this is controlled by a reflex, generally our conscious mind is not capable of generating a repressive impulse, something to suppress it, fast enough. The reflex happens before we are even aware that it's going to happen, and so we usually can't prevent it. And so if we take a look at those, and I'm going to go ahead and whoops, that's okay. That's okay. I'm going to go ahead and not what I want it to do. My apologies. Not now. So let's bring that back up. I'll have to go through and cut this out. So lots of fun for me. Anyway, if we go back over here, what we're going to look at is, I want to actually pull up my notes here, and this is my rough sketch that's going to represent a section of the spinal cord. And to orient you with this, we're going to look at this side, which is going to be my we're going to say that this area here is my dorsal side, so this will be dorsal. And then let's go ahead and make the green side. We'll go green for, we'll say this is my ventral, okay, just to kind of orient you there. And so I'm just going to use one side of this. Notice I didn't draw in the dorsal root ganglion because I'm just not that great of an artist, and we're just going to leave it with simplified pictures here. So I want you to think about reflexes. We have a number of different reflexes. Some of them you will be aware of. For example, the knee-jerk reflex, also called the patellar reflex, where if you hit the patellar tendon, you're going to trigger contraction of the quadricep muscles and relaxation of the hamstring muscles. So I'm actually going to use that one for my example. But you also have various other reflexes that are present, and some of them are used for diagnostic purposes. We test those reflexes to try to figure out any anomalies that might point to the presence of a nervous system disorder. So looking at the knee-jerk reflex, let's imagine, if you will, that we have some bad art going to happen here. So just warning you all. So here's my quads and hamstrings, and we'll do kind of like a calf here, and maybe not so bad. No, kind of like mutated toes. And then here we'll have kneecap. Okay, that looks really sad. Anyway, we're going to take our little reflex hammer here, okay, and we're going to strike it against that patellar tendon. And when that happens, what we have is, if we look at the patellar tendon, what is located in there are some mechanoreceptors that detect stretch or the deformation of that patellar tendon. And so as a consequence, that's going to send information. Let's go ahead and do pink to match my dorsal side. So we've got our little receptors here, and we'll say we've got these, they detect stretch. And so we're going to send that information through the dorsal root into, that's not what I want, through the dorsal root into the spinal cord, okay? And so what we actually have here for the spinal cord, it's a little reversed from the brain. In the brain, the gray matter is on the outer rim. In the spinal cord, the gray matter is in this center butterfly type portion here. And so we're going to synapse onto some cell bodies here. Now, the patellar reflex is often used to represent what is known as a monosynaptic reflex, okay? And so we're going to look at that, but I'm going to also draw this as branching. We do send information up, okay? These are mechanoreceptors, so that information is going to cross in the desiccation of the pyramids. That's the wrong word. But anyway, it's going to cross there, and we're going to process that information. But this takes time, and so by the time that reaches our somatosensory cortex, we will have already experienced this reflex. And then we're also going to draw a branch here, and I'm going to draw it like so. That's probably not anatomically accurate, but we're going to work with it there. Okay, so this synapse here, I want to point this one. We're going to follow this one. So this is going to synapse onto I'm altering my picture, sorry. So this is going to synapse. Let me kind of follow this down. We're going to make this longer. That's what I want to do. There we go. Okay, there we go. And this is going to synapse onto a motor neuron. And in particular, this is going to be a somatic motor neuron. And that somatic motor neuron is going to leave what we call the ventral horn. And somatic motor neurons, the cell body is always found in the spinal cord, and the axon will travel as far as it needs to travel to reach the muscles that we need to reach. And so that's going to come over here, and we're going to innervate the quadricep muscles. This is not meant in any way to be anatomically correct, okay? Just telling you. We're going to innervate the quadricep muscles. And so as the signal travels inward like so, and down like so, it stimulates that quadricep muscle, or that neuron that heads to the quadricep muscle, and it actually will result in contraction of the quadricep. And as that quadricep contracts, okay, we're going to get a little kick. Okay, so as this muscle contracts and shortens, we're going to get a little kick. Okay, and so that's going to cause, it's going to pull on the bones and cause that little kick, that little reflex. And so that's called monosynaptic, because we really only have in the spinal cord one synapse. So this is my monosynaptic. Synaptic. We can actually use this exact same synapse to represent polysynaptic. So here we're going to draw another branch so that you can understand it and see it. And I need to erase my monosynaptic. We'll put it on the other side so you can kind of, because I need room. So this is my monosynaptic. Okay. And now I'm going to draw another branch of this neuron here. And this, so because remember these nerve, we've got these, these would be called contralateral axons, right? And so if we look at this other branch, this is actually going to synapse onto one of those interneurons. Okay, one of those interneurons. And that interneuron is actually going to come down here into the ventral portion of the spinal cord, and it's going to synapse onto another motor neuron. But the difference here is important. This other motor neuron is going to supply the hamstrings. Again, please, this is not anatomically correct, and I've never claimed to be a great artist. The key with this interneuron, though, is it's going to be inhibitory. It's going to suppress. We're going to get an IPSP right here. IPSP. Whereas over here we're getting our EPSP. Okay? So that inhibitory prevents the contraction of the hamstring. So the hamstring relaxes and stretches as the quadricep contracts. And this, both processes are necessary. So the monosynaptic part is where the sensory neuron activates the neuron that supplies the quadricep. But the polysynaptic part is over here, because look, we've got synapse here and we've got a synapse here. Okay? Poly meaning more than one. Okay? And there are more complicated synapses than this. But we're going to leave it here in terms of explanation to help you understand this process. And so if we were to look at this step by step, step one is to have the activation, is we compress that stretch receptor and we activate that sensory neuron. From there, we're going to activate, step two would be to activate the motor neuron that supplies the quadricep, whereas that actually doesn't work. If we were to look at the monosynaptic sequence of events, let's try that again. Monosynaptic. Step one, strike the patellar tendon. Strike. And that's going to generate an action potential in the sensory receptor. And then that's going to generate an action potential in the motor neuron, specifically the somatic motor neuron. And that's going to generate, we haven't gotten into skeletal muscles, but it's going to generate an action potential in the skeletal muscle. Of the quadriceps. And that's going to cause the skeletal muscle to contract. So that's my monosynaptic pathway. My polysynaptic pathway is different. But remember, this is going to happen simultaneously, because as we contract the quad, we need to contract the hamstring. Otherwise, that kick isn't going to happen. Instead, we have the hamstring and the quad contracting against each other. Okay, and they're both pretty robust muscle groups. And so they will counteract each other, and we don't get a kick. So the polysynaptic reflex follows the same steps. Step 1, 2, and 1 and 2 are the same. So step 1 and 2 are the same. But step 3 activates the interneuron. And step 4, the interneuron suppresses of the motor neuron that innervates. That's a vocabulary word you want to know. Innervates means to supply with nerve endings, to supply with synaptic nerve terminals. Innervates the hamstring. And so if that is happening, then it's not really a step 5, but I'm going to list it here as step 5. Hamstring relaxes. Okay, and so we get our kick. All right, we get our kick. Now I do want to talk about, let's go back up here, and I want to, for sake of getting you to understand, I want you to look at this. Why do we have to have, for the hamstring, why do we even have to bother with an interneuron? Why can't we just directly synapse onto the hamstring motor neuron? We'll say, well, let's give us numbers. We're going to say motor neuron 1 and motor neuron 2. Why can't we do a direct connection there? And it has to do with the neurotransmitter that is released at the synapse by the sensory neuron. Neurons, because of the way gene transcription works, neurons really release one type of neurotransmitter, and that's it. And each type of neuron can release a different neurotransmitter. There are many interneurons, for example. Some of them are stimulatory. But in this particular case, this sensory neuron is going to release its neurotransmitter, and it will always be the same. So let's just say that sensory neuron, so let's kind of zoom in on that. So here's my sensory neuron that synapses with motor neuron 1, and over here will be my sensory neuron that synapses with interneuron, and there's my interneuron here. Okay, please forgive the bad art. And there's my motor neuron here. Okay. Well, at both synapses, it's going to release the neurotransmitter, and we can say, so I would have to actually double check this. I don't think it's actually acetylcholine, but it might be. We could say that this is the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, or maybe it's the neurotransmitter glutamate or whatnot. But at both synapses, acetylcholine would be released. You cannot have a situation, it's not possible for us to have a situation where one synapse released from the same exact neuron, one synapse releases acetylcholine and the other one releases glutamate. It doesn't happen, because the neurotransmitter that is being synthesized by this neuron it's synthesizing one type. Now you can have groups of types. For example, you might release acetylcholine and ATP or and VIP or what have you, but it always is going to release the same set. And so as a consequence to that, whether it's acetylcholine or whether it's norepinephrine or whether it's anything else, it's going to release the same neurotransmitter at the same spot. So if this neurotransmitter here is stimulatory, this neurotransmitter would also, because it's exactly the same thing, be stimulatory. In other words, one neuron cannot generate IPSPs and EPSPs at the same time. And so we have to have that interneuron to be able to kind of pass the torch, so to speak, to somebody who can, in fact, release inhibitory neurotransmitters. So I hope that makes sense to you. All right. Going back then to this particular here, I'm actually going to strongly recommend, so I kind of did a really, well, because I'm not the greatest artist, I'm going to strongly recommend that you actually go back and watch this one. This particular artist slash doctor who does a beautiful, amazing job of summarizing things succinctly, does an excellent job of talking about these reflexes and how they work. And so it's going to give you a lot more detail, a lot prettier drawings, a lot clearer information. And so I strongly recommend it. Of course, if you feel like what I've shared is sufficient, then you don't need to watch it. But it's my strong suggestion that you do. So that's it, guys. That's the sensory nervous system. We'll start next with the autonomic nervous system, the motor neurons. So we're going to be looking at the autonomic nervous system and a little bit about the skeletal muscle or the somatic motor nervous system. So that's coming up next.